royal residences, to a vast building in which you live over the shop, I suppose, really.
Once they moved into the palace, the Queen was preoccupied with matters of state. Behind the scenes, Philip launched another of his modernization programs.
When he first arrived at the palace, if one member of the family wanted to send a message to another member of the family, you summoned a footman, and you waited and you gave it to the footman, and you put it on the salver, and he then walked several hundred yards to the far end of the palace and gave it to the other member of the family. And Philip said, this is absolutely ridiculous.
As at Clarence House, Philip brought in gadgets, like internal telephones and washing machines. There was opposition from the more traditional courtiers. And other aspects of his life also started tongues wagging. Before he got married, Philip had enthusiastically enjoyed London's nightlife with lively friends like the actor David Niven. And he didn't abandon his socializing after he went down the aisle.
On more than one occasion, Philip came back so late that he had to climb over the wall because all the doors were locked. Philip found it very difficult to give up his bachelor ways. He had his coterie of men friends. Obviously, they knew other women. The rumours started abounding that all was not well with the marriage.
Philip's friends formed the so-called Thursday Club, which met every week at a restaurant in the bohemian Soho district of London. Philip's critics at court wondered what else they got up to. His restlessness showed through to fellow club members like harmonica player Larry Adler.
We had our usual dinner to Prince Philip, and Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, he was there. And all through dinner, Prince Philip was making remarks to the effect that Bernhard was a very lucky guy. Nobody knew what he looked like. He would have girlfriends wherever he liked. He said, I can't go anywhere without Secret Service men tailing me.
Rumors linked Philip's name with a whole series of glamorous women, like nightclub hostess Hélène Corday. They'd been friends since childhood, and he was godfather to her children. Other things in Philip's lifestyle kept the rumor mill turning. He embarked on a whole series of overseas tours, leaving his wife and children behind. At one point, the palace even issued an official statement denying that the marriage was in trouble. But the stories persisted.
I think he has a glitter in his eye. He has a fine physique, looks after himself very well. I think he's a flirtatious man, and I think that women find that very attractive.
Philip clearly enjoyed his solo tours, and rumors persisted that he had dallied with other women, but no evidence was produced, and if the Queen ever doubted him, she never showed it. Indeed, when the rumors were at their height in 1957, she chose the moment to restore to him the title Prince that he'd had to give up when he had married her.
I think it would be fair to say that Prince Philip is one of the lads. The Queen put up with it. And I think that, because they did have a successful marriage, and if the Queen had done what a lot of women have been inclined to do, the successful marriage would have been remarkably unsuccessful. So it was the Queen's tolerance that allowed the marriage to survive, and survive well.
Apart from solo tours, sports like sailing provided another safety valve to help Philip cope with the frustrations of royal life. They were one of the few areas in which he was allowed to compete with others on equal terms.
Once we got into those boats, we were both keen to win every race. And one day I remember going down in a very strong wind with a spinnaker, and the boat went over. And he was hanging in the water up to his neck, yelling at me, what the hell did I think I was doing? I said I was trying to keep the boat upright.
By the end of the 1950s, Philip seemed content with his role. He and the Queen would soon have 2 more sons, and doubts over the marriage were gradually laid to rest. But Philip's impatience with the niceties of royal protocol was to land him in trouble time and time again. Phil had been born 10 years after Princess Anne in 1960, and Prince Edward followed in 1964. In public, the family appeared happy enough. But many years later, complaints would be raised that as a father, Philip was too much of a disciplinarian. In the public arena, he certainly worked hard. But on official engagements, his relationship with the Queen was clear. She took the lead. He followed respectfully behind. In the constitutional arena, it was the same. She saw state papers. He didn't. If the Queen was getting briefed by her ministers, Philip shouldn't be involved. The widow of a former British Foreign Secretary saw how assertive the Queen could be.
There was sitting Prince Philip beside Queen and me beside Tony, and she wanted a briefing from Tony. But Prince Philip took it upon himself to enter the conversation between the Queen and Tony, and she simply turned to him and said, "Oh, Philip, do shut up." And he did.
A man as energetic as Philip had to carve out a role for himself, and he found it by venturing into areas where royalty had rarely trod. In the 60s, he began to court controversy. A favorite activity was to tour the most modern bits of British industry, like the nuclear reactor at Dounreay, and castigate other sectors for their shortcomings.
We are all in this unpleasant soup together. The adverse balance of payments is a national problem. There's never been any good saying, "I'm all right, Jack, this is somebody else's problem."
Although he never liked the media, Philip was perhaps the first member of the royal family to recognize that they couldn't afford to ignore its existence. Not only did he break with precedent by making interesting and provocative speeches, he also provided photo opportunities, like taking the controls of the supersonic aircraft Concorde. And most revolutionary of all, he began holding press conferences and actually answered questions from the media.
As some of you are keen on conservation, what do you think of the level of noise and smoke?
I was inside and I wasn't smoking. The noise, of course, you don't have to talk to me about aircraft noise. If you look on the map, you'll see that Windsor Castle is not very far from the end of London Airport. The main runway is at London Airport at one end, and Buckingham Palace is not very far from it at the other. And as for aircraft noise, you know all about it.
Philip's new approach brought him a higher media profile. But stories didn't always turn out as he wanted. Philip is a keen shot, and he and his friends have brought down thousands of birds on the royal estate. But he also became a champion of wildlife as international president of the Worldwide Fund for Nature. Critics of Philip felt that his pursuit of shooting as a sport marked him down as a hypocrite, especially when he shot a tiger in India.
How can anyone? I mean, really, he gets pleasure out of shooting a beautiful thing like a tiger. I mean, everyone loves tigers. And to turn around and kill that is a gross, blatant act of vandalism, wanton destruction.
Philip's relations with the media were often abrasive. Royals weren't used to criticism, and Philip didn't like it. Even years later, he still seemed to resent questioning over the tiger episode.
There was a time when you, I think, went on tiger shoots, presumably.
No, I never went on tiger shoots. I went on one shoot.
Not a thing that was...
Got one tiger that happened to be lame at the time, anyway. And I imagine you weren't even born then, anyway, so I don't know what you know about it.
To his admirers, Philip is a refreshingly down-to-earth character, free from airs and graces.
Philip doesn't suffer fools nicely. Speaks his mind very clearly and very honestly. And being a very straightforward and honest man, he will say a lot of the times what he thinks. And then some people will get upset about it.
Upsetting people on royal tours, though, can be a major problem. They're generally undertaken with some ulterior motive, to smooth a difficulty or cement a friendship. Philip was dubbed the Duke of Hazard, as his plain speaking led to them being peppered with unwelcome controversy. One of his most serious gaffes came in China in 1986, when he was speaking to a visiting Scottish student.
Young Simon Kirby piped up and said,
very forthright man, Prince Philip, isn't he? I said, oh, yeah. And he said, he told us that he thought modern teaching was ghastly and boring. And then he said, if you stay here much longer, you get sooty eyes. And I thought, oh, God.
The Queen's visit had been intended to ease negotiations with the Chinese over Britain's withdrawal from Hong Kong. Through his slitty eyes comment, Philip was soon being accused of damaging one of the most diplomatically sensitive royal tours in years.
The Queen was absolutely livid with him because it did get picked up by the Chinese very fast. And all those wonderful days of good work that the Queen had done were ruined by Prince Philip.
If Philip was abashed by the storm his remarks stirred up, it wasn't obvious.
I've always got the impression with Philip that he enjoys rubbing people up the wrong way, just to see what the reaction that he gets. And because he's never afraid to say whatever comes into his mind, he quite often does rub people up the wrong way.
While the Queen took the lead in public, it was generally accepted that Philip ruled the roost when it came to home and the 4 children. By the mid-80s, the 3 eldest had all been safely married off. But the tribulations of the children were to lead to severe criticism of Philip as a father and to plunge the monarchy into its worst crisis for half a century. By the early 90s, more and more people were questioning the way Prince Philip had brought up his children, as one by one their marriages started to fail. The first to divorce was Princess Anne in 1992. By then, Prince Andrew was already separated from Sarah Ferguson. But worse was in store. Prince Charles's fairy tale marriage to Princess Diana had begun to fall apart amid bitter recrimination. Both cooperated with books giving their side of the story. Charles's account made Philip appear a distant and undemonstrative parent. Critics complained that his approach had involved too much discipline and not enough feeling.
When he was trying to teach Prince Charles to swim at the swimming pool at Buckingham Palace, and Charles being very, very reluctant even to get into the water, Philip just lost his temper and picked him up and threw him into the water.
He's a tough man. I think he wanted his children to be like him, and in many ways, yes, that would have not been a bad idea, particularly being in the public eye that they are. But those children, except for Princess Anne, weren't capable of this.
The criticisms of Philip as a family man extended further. He was also accused of being unhelpful and unwelcoming to those who married into the royal family, like Princess Diana or Sarah Ferguson. He had come up the hard way himself and didn't see why others should need help.
Philip's view about royalty is that either you're born to it, or you just watch the way other people behave and follow their example. Therefore, he was not going to sit down with his daughters-in-law and say, look, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. All he would say would do as I do, or do as the Queen does. And that should have been, in his view, all the guidance and help that they needed.
If Philip felt that someone had failed to live up to their royal responsibilities, he saw no reason to hide his anger. Every year, the royal family goes to the horse races at Ascot. It's always a widely covered event. In the early 90s, Philip chose the occasion to deliver a snub to Diana as he sat alone in the royal box.
Diana mistakenly wandered into the royal box, and there was this huge area that would seat about 100, and Philip saw her out of the corner of his eye while he was reading the racing program, and didn't bother to stand up. I mean, gross bad manners. Didn't bother to stand up and just completely ignored Diana, who hesitated. I watched, she hesitated and thought, should I go into this lion's den or not? She eventually did, and she went and sat 20 rows behind him. but never once did Philip even acknowledge her presence. He'd had enough of her, and he wanted her to know exactly how he felt.
For a monarchy that saw itself as the embodiment of family values, a series of failed marriages was a disaster. But the death of Princess Diana was an even worse blow. As Britain was swept by an unprecedented tide of public grief, the royal family was castigated as being uncaring and out of touch. Prince Philip had always believed in the stiff upper lip, and he had seen no reason to change.
He was always a tough, men don't blood in public sort of bloke. And I think, part of, his feeling about the royal family was, if we're going to have a royal family, then to a certain extent it is going to be different, and it's not going to react in the way that perhaps other people would.
Whatever the criticisms of Philip, few would deny that he had steadfastly and untiringly supported the Queen in her duties. It was for his loyalty that she publicly thanked him when they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1997, at the end of one of the most difficult years the royal family has faced.
He is someone who doesn't take easily the compliment, but he has quite simply been my strength and stay all these years.
Anybody who's said over the years this marriage has been one of convenience, that proves without doubt they'd got it wrong. And there may have been the odd blip, but my God, it's been infrequent between them. I think that day showed real warmth, and much more than that, real love between those two.
According to the Constitution, Philip's role was supposed to be severely limited, but many now saw confirmed what they'd always believed, that the Queen constantly turned to him for advice.
He officially does not see spectators. I would be very, very surprised indeed if there was anything significant that had taken place in the Queen's reign that the Queen didn't discuss with him.
Perhaps the most important thing Philip had to discuss with the Queen now was how the monarchy could recover public support. For a long time, many in Britain had seen it as too expensive. After Princess Diana's death, more and more people began to question whether it was needed at all. Even some defenders of the royal family now argued that it needed to be downsized and made less formal. The young Prince Philip had been a modernizer, but the older Philip, now in his late 70s, was seen by some as increasingly suspicious of change.
I think he would like to see a return to the people of not only the UK and Britain, but the Commonwealth, being more respectful towards the position of sovereign. As he's getting older, he is more and more traditional. I think he is hardening his line enormously into how the monarchy could be. I keep seeing him thinking back to a century ago, into Victorian times.
Philip has always seen himself as chief executive of the family firm. If he were to look back now on his time at the helm with the plain speaking that's characterized so many of his public performances, some believe he'd deliver a fairly critical verdict, that the monarchy is in its worst state since King Edward VIII abdicated in 1936.
I don't think he will see himself as being hugely successful. I mean, the children who all got married have all ended up in divorce. The monarchy is in a greater crisis now than it probably has been, it certainly has been, since the abdication. I mean, you could argue that it's probably in a worse situation than it was at the time of the abdication.
Philip isn't the kind of man to agonize over what might have been, and his loyalty and commitment to the Queen have been beyond doubt. Others, though, did ponder the question of what would have happened to him if, all those years ago, he hadn't won her heart, and had had to see where his own talents would take him, instead of playing the supporting role to her.
I think that, from his own perspective, he felt that he'd been denied the opportunity to fulfill his talents to the best of his ability. He would have made and possibly should have made what he wanted to be, which was a British naval officer. That was probably the best role that life would have given him, but the fates took over.
For a long time after he joined the royal family, Prince Philip had been the outsider who insisted on belatedly dragging it into the 20th century. His fresh approach had provoked howls of protest from traditionalists. But that was 50 years ago. Now, Philip looked in danger of being left behind by a tide of change that threatened to engulf the monarchy, and whose final limit few would dare to predict.
Earlier today, Prince Philip marked the first anniversary of Diana's death. Along with the Queen and other members of the royal family, he attended a private prayer service in Scotland. In spite of his well-publicized blunders, many British people realize Prince Philip has provided a measure of stability in an era of uncertainty. Philip and Queen Elizabeth have endured all the turmoil of rumors and the